Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing Joe Biden, the new president of the United States, allowing for those airstrikes to take place in Syria against what the U.S. has called Iran-backed militia groups that were there, and that this was all in retaliation to attacks that had taken place on U.S. forces in places like Iraq and otherwise as well. Now, of course, at issue is, as has been with previous presidents recently, the issue of war powers altogether. And we've had just discussion, I believe, over the past 24 hours to 48 hours of a number of senators and congressmen who are looking to put forth a bill to sort of control a president's powers, to be able to then strike in places around the world, especially the Middle East. There is conversation, of course, about that, and has been going on for a while now, as I said, with previous presidents as well. The justification seemingly has not satisfied even Democrat senators as well, who sat in on a briefing that was given to Senate aides, saying that the justifications given were simply not satisfactory when it came to this entire issue of the strike on these apparently Iranian-backed militias, again, in Syria. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Calvin Dark, who is the principal and co-founder of RC Communications. He's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us this morning from Columbus, Ohio, is Dr. Peter Hahn, who is a professor of history at Ohio State University with a specialization in the history of U.S. foreign policy. Peter and Calvin, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Peter, let me start with you. Do you think that Biden was justified in carrying out this airstrike on Syria?
That's an interesting question, and the word justified can be taken on two different grounds. One is whether it was justified under U.S. national security interests. The other is whether it was justified under U.S. law. With regard to national security interests, it did seem to be a calibrated retaliation for a wave of recent Iran-backed assaults on U.S. assets in the region. Enough to exert some pain on Iran and its allies, but not enough to imperil, at least Biden hopes, the possibility of a restoration of the nuclear agreement of 2015. With regard to U.S. law, justification is ambiguous. As your introduction to this topic indicated, that's a matter of great controversy among U.S. lawmakers and policymakers in Washington, D.C., whether the existing legal authorizations to use force in the Middle East cover this type of attack against Syria. That's a matter of debate today in Washington. That point of debate continues a discussion in the United States that has occurred for decades. One might even argue it ranges back as far as the founding of the country and the signing of the U.S. Constitution in 1789.
Right. So what are your thoughts about this? Because, even Democrats are not happy here.
Well, I think that what you said in the beginning is very true, that this has been an area of tension for Democrats, Republicans, between the White House and Congress. And I also think that it demonstrates in our democracy one of the strongest things we have is that balance of power. Because even senators and members of the House of Representatives who clearly support President Biden stood up against this. Because what they realize is that this is a critical question about the powers of Congress versus the White House. Now, I will say, a lot of folks have been wondering, well, why wouldn't, Biden seek authorization or inform or notify Congress as they had wanted? I think the problem is that we have kind of existed in this space, particularly over the last decade, of a Congress that is perfectly fine to not do anything. So everything that is done by Congress, it's like pulling teeth. And to get the basic things like our budget and other key measures. So can you imagine a scenario where the White House has to now go to Congress to come to a decision on something where there isn't a real consensus about where the threat is and how it threatens or doesn't U.S. interests. So I see why I did it. And of course, no president wants to restrict their powers as commander in chief and leave it up to 535 representatives and senators. So I think that that's the tension we're seeing. And it's not a pro-Biden or anti-Biden thing. It's something that we've, as the other guest was saying, we've dealt with since the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, that's a point, isn't it, Peter, that putting it to Congress would possibly be a very inefficient process, right? Especially if, in the case that you need to, as Commander-in-Chief, react immediately. Now, imagine, of course, there are loopholes and there's fine print within even what is allowed and what is not allowed to allow for such a scenario if there needs to be an immediate reaction. But nevertheless, but then on the other side, there's also then the very valid argument that the president shouldn't just have a completely free hand. I mean, somebody needs to hold him to account for allowing for strikes that may potentially at some point lead to war if somebody were to take it there. How does one balance that, do you think, in your opinion?
The prospect of balance, I think, could be based on the War Powers Act of 1973, which was passed at the height of the anti-Vietnam backlash. It was an effort by Congress to rein in the so-called imperial presidency, which was a period of presidential power in the context of the Cold War, in which presidents led the United States into major conflicts, including Korea and Vietnam, without having secured the constitutionally mandated declaration of war. The War Powers Act laid out terms under which presidents could commit U.S. forces to hostile situations. There either had to be a declaration of war, or there had to be an authorization to use military force, or in the event of an acute emergency, the president could take immediate action to defend the United States or U.S. troops overseas, provided that he notified Congress within 48 hours and provided that he withdrew all of those U.S. forces within 60 days in the absence of an explicit congressional sanction. That law was vetoed by President Nixon when it passed, and then Congress passed it over his veto, another sign of the division of powers between the two co-equal branches of government. The current controversy centers on the authorizations to use military force, which Congress passed in 2001 and 2002. The first AUMF authorized military action against any perpetrators behind the 9/11 attack. The second AUMF authorized the use of force against Iraq. Those two legal actions gave authority to President Bush to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, the controversy today is whether those 2001 and 2002 legal authorizations provide legal permission to President Biden to conduct the attack of last week. It was against an adversary that did not exist when the AUMF was passed in 2001. And it was in a country, Syria, that is clearly not Iraq. And that's the basis for the Democrats' protest against that action. That President Biden exceeded the legal authority that Congress gave him. To push the debate forward in Washington today would be a matter of clarifying whether the AUMFs of 2001, 2002 need to be abridged or need to be overturned or maybe need to be expanded in some way to make very clear what authority the president has ahead of time to commit U.S. forces to hostile action.
Indeed. Evan, let's talk politics now, if we may, and just foreign policy overall, beyond just the law and what the law allows the president to do or not to do. Was it savvy? Was it smart to react in this fashion? I mean, if this was done in a defensive fashion, as the U.S. is claiming, was it smart to do this? Because, you know, this is a very volatile region, especially Syria. And that too, you're going up against Iran. And that's already an extremely volatile relationship, especially since Donald Trump walked away from the nuclear deal.
Yes. And, you know, as we say here in Washington, everything is political at some level. I think that there are two political dynamics that are at play that the Biden administration is seeking to address. One is with the Iran, so let's say negotiations happening with the Iran deal. A lot of people on the Republican side, a lot of people who supported President Trump, believed that Joe Biden would not be strong with Iran as they believe Trump had been. So that's one dynamic that Joe Biden wants to make sure that he can't do anything that could give the perception that he's being weak towards Iran. Also, the second political dynamic is, you know, during the Trump administration, one of the things that plagued his foreign policy efforts was there was always a suspicion as to what was behind it. And because of whether, you know, whether it was corruption or whether it was just personal relationships. There were certain leaders around the world that he didn't want to upset, and it sometimes seemed that he put their interest in his relationships with them over the interests of the United States. Well, I think that was a real fear during the Trump administration, that there were U.S. soldiers and U.S. interests at risk around the world, and that Trump was doing nothing. So Biden also had to make sure that he was not giving that impression, that he would be strong, unlike his predecessor, to protect U.S. interests and U.S. military and personnel. So I think those were just two of the political dynamics behind what the Biden administration did.
Peter, I'll give you the final before I let both of you go. On that point of the politics of this and just the overall foreign policy view on this, what are your thoughts? Because, as I said, this very well, I mean, with any such strike and with any such, be it retaliation or an offensive strike, either way, I don't want to get into that debate, but just with this sort of action altogether, there's always the potential for it to go very, very wrong, right? Depending on how the other side then responds. Is this savvy foreign policy?
Well, time will tell. I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the dilemma and the unknowns of the future. The Biden administration clearly calibrated its retaliation of last week to send a signal to Iran that it needs to stop backing what the U.S. considers terrorist attacks against U.S. assets and U.S. allies throughout the region. It's possible that Iran will respond by escalating, and conflict of a greater degree will ensue. In my judgment, it's also quite possible that Iran will decide to de-escalate, to downscale the severity of the attack, and to move forward with diplomacy. The struggle for the Biden administration is that it wants to accomplish two objectives. One is to renew the 2015 nuclear accord, and the second is to stop what it considers Iran-backed terrorist strikes against its assets and its allies throughout the region. Biden is aiming for a middle-of-the-road policy with last week's retaliatory strike designed to accomplish both of those ends. That's a very delicate balancing act. There's no guarantee that he will succeed, but there is some hope that he will succeed, because this type of degradation of threat and downgrading of tension has occurred in other situations in the past.
Very well. They're at that, but we appreciate both Calvin and Peter for taking their time out this morning to share their thoughts with us. This is an extremely important issue, right? The entire issue, the macro issue, that is, of a U.S. president's war powers altogether. Yes, as commander-in-chief, no doubt, with any such leader around the world, you need to have the power to immediately react if you so need to in defense of your nation. Was this attack in Syria in that regard? I mean, was it such a situation where he really needed to react in such a fashion? I mean, the argument online, especially on social media, has been that, listen, just 35 days into his presidency, he's already attacking, essentially, the Middle East and sparking what could very well have been a war had Iran or Syria reacted very drastically at that time. What will happen now? Where exactly does Congress come in and the Senate come in vis-a-vis their powers that they should have over, accountability regarding a president's such actions, military actions, that is? That, of course, is a debate that we will continue to keep a close eye on here in Scope as well. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. This segment, we're going to discuss Nigeria. It's been in the news once again because even more students have been kidnapped there, though these ones have been released, the latest ones. A significant number of girls who had been kidnapped from their respective school. Now, of course, at issue, increasingly, really, is the fact that there is a debate, I would think, even within Nigeria, certainly, and outside, about whether or not ransom payments are being made to the bandits who are kidnapping these students and even others, really, as well as overall just national security in the country. I mean, the fact that this keeps happening over and over again does point to certainly a huge vacuum, security vacuum, if I may say that, especially around schools and otherwise. And certainly there's a lot of context within the country about security issues, be it Boko Haram or otherwise, but these seemingly are different from the regular terrorist threat altogether, or maybe they're not. Maybe they are connected, as our guests may point out to us. Let's discuss Nigeria's security a bit further with our esteemed panelists who are joining us today. We're joined now by Dr. Folarin, who is a professor at and head of Department of Political Science and International Relations at Covenant University. He's joining us today from Lagos in Nigeria. Joining us this morning from Boston, Massachusetts is Dr. Darren Q, who is an associate professor and executive director of the Center for Peace, Democracy and Development at University of Massachusetts, Boston. And joining us from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario in Canada is Dr. Olabanji Akinola, who is an assistant professor in international relations and comparative politics at the Department of Law and Politics at Algoma University. Olabanji, Darren, and Sheriff, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out to join us here in Scope today. Olabanji, let me start with you. Is the issue here the fact that ransoms are being paid, do you think?
Thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. The issue, the ransom payment is in response to something that has become, unfortunately, a pathway for so-called bandits to make money. However, it's also a reflection of the very fragile security architecture that Nigeria has had to deal with, where you have to move from one problem to the other. The biggest issue being that you cannot, the Nigerian state seems to be unable to respond to multiple security challenges effectively at once. So it's not just a question of paying ransom. It's also a case of having to deal with multiple security challenges ineffectively at any point in time.
You know, I would think it's not something to be proud of, right, for Nigeria, that every so often we hear about these sorts of kidnappings. What is going wrong? Is it just that the country is genuinely overwhelmed with the security challenges that it faces?
That's certainly a piece of the puzzle. Just to add to what Olabanji had to say, you know, the military in Nigeria is deployed in something like 33 different states. So you have crises in the northeast with Boko Haram. You have the farmer-herder crisis across the center of the country. You have the banditry, of which the kidnapping is a piece. And then, you know, you have an ongoing crisis in the Niger Delta. Plus, you have concerns in the southwest and the southeast. So all across the federation, the Nigerian military and the police are stretched with security issues. But the deeper issue really here is a governance problem. At root to these concerns are widespread corruption in governance, which is also fueling and benefiting from the kidnapping crisis. You have ongoing economic problems, massive unemployment across the country and widespread poverty. You have an environmental problem with growing desertification in the north, which is creating stress on the northern economy, as well as a massive population boom in the north, which is creating demographic stresses. So all of these together are creating a very difficult environment across northern Nigeria, where lucrative kidnapping arrangements has been created in Zamfara and other parts of the north, become appealing markets for criminal gangs that are active.
So, Sheriff, tell us about what the conversation is like within Nigeria itself at this point. How does one go about then providing proper employment opportunities so that you don't have people kidnapping children to make a buck?
Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me this afternoon. Before I answer that question, let me quickly address some of the very salient points that my colleagues have put to the table. You see, we have multiple security challenges, not because we don't have the capacity to tackle the security challenges, but because we lack the political will. There is no political will at the level of leadership to tackle these multiple security challenges. You look at the Nigerian army, for instance, or you want to look at the entire military, the armed forces, for instance, they still rank as the 5th best in Africa. And so why are they not able to handle issues that have become national security challenges? But in terms of internal security, you have the Nigerian police with the adequate manpower given to them and the latitude provided for the police increasingly on a yearly basis. And then the increase in salary and motivation and all of that is given to the police. But Why are they not able to tackle issues of kidnapping, banditry in the north central and the northwest now? Why are they not able to tackle the issue of ritual killings in the southwest and some, some kind of militia activities in the south and southeast? Why are they not able to do this? It's not because they are overwhelmed. It's because they don't have. There's no political will on the part of government, and this, it dovetails into a conversation in the country now, which of course is the fact that probably some people in government are complicit, or that they just feel that some of these guys are their brothers. At some point, we've had some people in leadership referring to Boko Haram as brothers or fellow citizens, and therefore they shouldn't be killed, but attempts should be made to tame them without killing them, without allowing for collateral damage and the rest of that. So that's one. Then the second thing is, the question you asked is, if you're taking the youth out of the unemployment market, will that reduce the tendencies for these security challenges? The answer is no, it will not. It's not about employment. I think it flows from what had just been answered in terms of political will, and it also flows from the fact that whether the banditry and terrorism, whether they are, both of them are one and the same, and banditry is just a manifestation, continuation of Boko Haram and ISWAP terrorist activities, and an attempt, a very surreptitious but bold attempt to get to the south and, of course, establish themselves very firmly there. And whether some people in government are interested in this.
Okay, if you allow me, Sheriff. Sheriff, I wanted to put that point, because that's a very good point you made there. Olabanji, let's talk about then political will on the part of the security forces, the head of security forces, of course, as well as the government. I mean, I would think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, with all these kidnappings and when you have your own children, i.e. the country's children, at risk in this fashion, that that sort of political pressure must be massive. Will we finally see better action in this regard?
Yeah, thanks. Just to back up and clarify that point, the political will to do things when it comes to a situation like this actually tends to occur in situations where the government feels embarrassed and the government feels this is getting out of hand. Now, in 2000, and just to give you background to how we got here, in 2019, April 2019, the Nigerian government, federal government, banned illegal mining, which was what the bandits became known for protecting. 2019, April. And the government, the Nigerian Air Force, the Nigerian Army, the Nigerian police went into Zamfara through all kinds of angles, including area bombardment to dislodge. In other words, they responded to the political will by the president at that President Buhari to flush out the bandits at that time. Now, where the fault, the weakness of the security system is that they did end up pushing out a few bandits here and there. However, that didn't stop the banditry. Now, disrupting the activities of the bandits, especially with regard to illegal mining, means they would need to find somewhere else to make money, which is why we're here now. And they figured out that the government of both the state government of Zamfara State as well as the government of President Buhari will take note when they begin to abduct massive amounts of students and demand ransom. The other thing that needs to be mentioned is that when you kidnap school kids, the Nigerian Army and the Nigerian Air Force will be reluctant, and they are always reluctant, to drop bombs on these locations because you might mistakenly kill the students. And the bandits know that very well, that if you engage in all kinds of kidnapping and at any point in time you're able to at least find a sizable number of students in your custody, it will reduce the military push into the area while also making them a lot of money. So the political will, I would say, at some point kicks in. In this particular case of Zamfara, if you do a very clear historical connecting the dots in the past 10 years, there has been efforts. Now, I do admit, and I would acknowledge that in Nigerian context, there are political interferences and lack of political will from time to time. But in certain cases and at certain times, whether it's Boko Haram or whether we're dealing with the case of bandits now, you will find there are times where political will is actually there, but the idea of the fractured security architecture and the idea that the poverty and the unemployment that Darren mentioned are fueling those things are very, very potent.
Okay, so the political will seems to exist. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, A? And then what then needs to happen? Is it a question then of the country needing external help then?
Well, I do think that the political will has been tepid. I think the Buhari administration has been slow to take this as seriously as it could, as it has been with many of the other security concerns across the country, short of Boko Haram, and its response to Boko Haram has not been as forceful or as comprehensive as many of us had hoped. But nonetheless, I mean, the president did dismiss all of the service chiefs last month. He has a new team, a new security team in place. Last year, he changed the inspector general of police. So there have been some more recent efforts, at least to try to change the senior management. But really, the deeper issue that is still not being addressed is reform of the military and the police. Police reform in particular is way overdue. The police themselves, in addition to being having massive capacity issues in terms of dealing with these problems, is one of the most corrupt institutions in the country, and is extremely unreliable in these sorts of activities. And in many instances, we see the police are in fact have negotiation or bargaining relationships with some of the criminal gangs. And are benefiting from this. It's clear as well that there are government officials that are benefiting from some of the ransom payments. So they're skimming off the top as money is being paid to these various criminal bands. So you have significant actors in the government apparatus, from the military to the civilian side, as well as the criminal economy, that are benefiting tremendously from the current circumstances. And this is a pattern we saw in the Niger Delta. This is a pattern we've seen with Boko Haram in the Northeast as well, that has been undermining the effectiveness of government response. So this is where a more forceful response from the center is important. In terms of international help, certainly Nigeria is benefiting from international actors in terms of military assistance and advice. I do think more help could be given. And I think as well more help on the civil society side in terms of empowering the public watchdogs that can try to provide some kind of a check on the security forces, and also provide some increasing pressure on the ground, like we've seen with what's called the NSARS movement, to try to push for police reforms in Lagos.
Okay, so Sheriff, we recently had just, I believe it was today or just yesterday itself, when the children were meant to be returned to their parents, we had that shooting. It seemed like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, is that the authorities were very worried about having a proper photo op, right, when this handover ceremony, if I may call it that, of these girls back to their respective parents. There was a whole show made of it. Do you think that was also emblematic sort of the attitude that goes into these sorts of kidnappings? To me it would seem like torturous, wouldn't it, for you to ask parents to wait and wait and wait till their girls are brought back to them. That sort of defeats the entire purpose and sort of shows like you're just trying to use this as a political photo op.
23 is not far from now, and politicians leverage on any available platform or resource to make themselves to consolidate their chances of winning the next elections. And there is one narrative that a lot of people are shy of, and that's the fact that some of these acts of banditry that we see today may not be unconnected to attempts by certain political forces to either make maybe the current administration look unpopular, or it could even be that this administration is behind this to ensure that it creates some kind of atmosphere of frenzy, fear, and disorder, so as to be able to for certain political benefits. There are so many things going on. I am not a fan of conspiracy theories, but I do know that there are certain undercurrents, and some conversations we are having amongst ourselves as Nigerians and as colleagues, they are such that they point to the fact that there is so much of politics that goes on here. So the follow-up and all of that is not a surprise to me. It's expected. And one of the things that I have come to realize the fact that all the three levels of government, the three tiers of government, they are to blame for whatever it is that we have at the moment. If the president was talking about the fact that paying ransoms for the release of these children is wrong. He was also talking about the fact that he's going to embolden and energize them. That's fine. It's a very good one. It's part of the political, statements that are made just to make one look popular or one acceptable to warm oneself up to society and all of that. But we must note that the local, when we have problem at the local level, where you have political leaders at local level, and of course, ordinary citizens of Nigeria aiding and abetting banditry in terms of giving them covering. Like my friend, the first speaker, said that there's going to be collateral damage if the Air Force, for instance, is going to be bombarding areas where they take these children and all of that. Yeah, I agree, but it is for the locals. These things will not happen in the first place because you cannot. It's like, it's even easier for you to have the thread go through the eye of the needle than to have about 317, children pass through forest, bush tracks, pass through so many places, and then the security forces, they are not watching, no surveillance. So at the local level, there's a lot of covering, there's a lot of aiding and abetting. So we are to blame at the local level. At the state level, some of the state governments are playing politics with this thing. Some of them, they lack political will. They are very clueless. They don't even know what to do. Some just feel that it's an opportunity again to kind of begin to start.
Okay, Sheriff, I do sincerely apologize for cutting off. I do apologize. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us, though, of course, I would want this conversation to continue a lot more, as I'm sure myself and viewers have learned a lot about the context, of course, of Nigeria. But we appreciate Sheriff Darren and Olabanji for taking their time out of their respective busy schedules to share their expert insight with us. Sheriff speaking to us there from Lagos, Darren speaking to us from Boston, and Olabanji was speaking to us from Sault Ste. Marie in Ontario, Canada. We were discussing there, of course, the issue of ransoms being paid to bandits who are kidnapping children from various schools across Nigeria. This has happened so many times now that it's really hard to ignore this as a pattern that somebody certainly is making money off of. And, the report by SB Morgan has shown that around $18 million of ransom has been paid to these bandits. This is, of course, not just to do with the fact that people want to just kidnap children for the sake of it. They're making money off of it, and there's issues of unemployment. There are security vacuums, but yes, there are also massive security challenges that the country faces. However, as Sheriff there had mentioned, it's also a question of political will, and our other guests also agreed with that in many regards. So will the Buhari government then step up? Will the security forces then step up and do the right thing in this regard? Again, to have a country's children over and over again to be endangered in this way seems like a recipe for complete disaster. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Switzerland and a referendum that is upcoming there about banning the burqa, or the niqab, as is also known. It's something that Muslim women, those who choose to wear it, do wear face veils as well. There are varying, of course, kinds of it. There's ones in which your eyes are showing, and there are others which cover the face completely. Again, this is down to a Muslim woman's choice, and within this referendum that has been being pushed for by right-wing party and politicians in Switzerland. This is now being put for a referendum. You'll remember that not too long ago, in 2009, voters accepted legislation by the same party and by the same group that is pushing for the Burqa Ban now to ban the building or construction of any new minarets in Switzerland as well. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Baptiste Brodard, who is a doctor in social sciences and religious studies. He's joining us today from Fribourg in Switzerland. Baptiste, thank you for joining us today. What do you make of the referendum? From what I've understood, there are not that many women within Switzerland who actually wear the niqab. I mean, it's between 21 and 37.
Good afternoon, sir. Thanks a lot to invite me here. And you summarized the situation very well. You remind that a bit more than 10 years ago, there was the vote on minarets. Now there is the vote on the niqab, even if they don't call it like this. And as you said, yes, there are just between 20 and 30 women in Switzerland wearing the niqab. So it doesn't concern a lot of people. That's the less we can say. Exactly like the minarets votes 10 years ago didn't concern the situation because no one wanted to construct and build minarets at that time. So it's like a repetition of what's happened a few years ago.
All right. So what the government has said, and I found this interesting, Baptiste, is that they're not only talking about the fact that this is against a woman's right to choose what she wears, but they're actually talking about how this will hurt tourism as well. Is that a fair concern?
Yeah, exactly. That's the main concern they can have, or maybe not the most important, but one of them, because when I said that 20 to 30 Swiss women wear the niqab in Switzerland, that's very few. That doesn't count because we have a country with 8 million people, 500,000 Muslims here, and 20 to 30 women wearing the niqab is, personally, I have never seen such a woman here. But there are tourists coming from Gulf countries, sometimes wearing niqab, and they go quite a lot to different towns or countryside in Switzerland, and that will make a big issue for the government because they will send a bad signal to these people that they are not welcome anymore. And I think also that's part of economic interest for the country to try not to offend these tourists, these visitors who are welcome. So the law, if it passes, will trigger some contradiction. But I think a main issue even is the image, the public image that this vote may send to the world. As today you discussed that from Pakistan, and we can see that although there's no issue here with the niqab, they are making an issue from nothing, and that sends a bad picture from the country to a lot of space in the world.
Exactly. You know, if we're talking about overall just the image of Switzerland in the world, right, and just for Muslims themselves in the country, right now it's interesting, right, and I'm sure you've heard this argument, Baptiste, that it's ironic that any government would want to tell a woman what she can and cannot wear when actually we're being told right now that you should all be wearing face masks because of the pandemic. I mean, there's a bit of hypocrisy there, right?
Indeed, it's very ironic, and that's why also some feminist groups who are not Muslims at all just opposed to this vote because they think that's an offense to the woman's freedom. And it's ironic because at the same time, the partisan of this law said that they do this in order to defend women's dignity, in order to defend the freedom of women. But the other camps exactly say the same thing. So the arguments repeat in both camps. It's the issue of women's dignity in both sides, is the issue of freedom, is the issue of letting the woman making their own choice. And here we are in full contradictions in a lot of arguments we can hear. As the Swiss women wearing the niqab, actually in Switzerland, they do that by their free will. And the proof is that even the family doesn't wear the same clothes. So, for instance, a woman who is wearing the niqab here has her parents or mother wearing just the hijab or nothing at all. And that's a pure personal choice, which shows freedom, and to discuss freedom to try to prevent such clauses is a contradiction, I think.
All right, so as a final comment then, Baptiste, before I let you go, what is the relationship, in your opinion, right now between Muslims and the establishment, the Swiss establishment, the rest of Swiss society? I mean, this sort of referendum makes it seem like, at least, that the relationship is not very good.
Actually, I think that it's difficult to summarize for everybody because you can observe a lot of different ways of dealing with this issue here. I think the vast majority of Muslims don't care about the law. They don't feel concerned at all. They think that's a stupid vote who doesn't interest anybody. I think that's the majority of them. But at the same time, also a lot of Muslims may be offended. They feel under pressure. They feel that they always have to face discrimination and new laws, and they don't know to which extent it will cease, to which extent it will go in the future. So that's why a lot of people talk about Islamophobia, while other Muslims, they may even vote against the niqab because they are opposed to this practice. But I think here the issue is not on Muslims. The issue is more about the public image the country wants to give, and the issue is about making politics away from priorities. Because again, as you said, as you summed up at the beginning, we only have between 20 to 30 people concerned by this law. So it's nonsense in terms of politics.
Very well, I'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate your taking your time out to speak to us today and for sharing your insight with us. We were discussing there with Baptiste, who's joining us from Switzerland, discussing this upcoming referendum. It's set to happen on March the 7th. According to the polls that I've seen, at least online, this will possibly narrowly pass. Back in 2009, as I said, the minaret ban, the construction of new minarets, that is, in Switzerland, that ban passed as well by voters who had voted back then in a referendum as well. So what will this mean for Muslims going forward? I mean, what is the relationship right now between the state and the rest of society and Muslims as well? Why exactly are they in the crosshairs at this point in time? And the usual excuses about terrorism, etc., always come up. But is it fair to then tell a woman what she can and or cannot wear? Doesn't that sort of go against the whole grain of what these Western societies and a society like Switzerland, which for the rest of us on the outside would always seem like a society which would be held up as a moral authority for the rest of us to follow? Does such a society have a right to tell a woman what she cannot wear as well? That seems sort of ironic and sort of defeats the entire purpose of freedom, doesn't it? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.